What's up, guys? How are y'all doing? My name is Rob of Rule of Two Review, and welcome back. So today we're doing something a little bit different, and it's actually something that I've kind of been wanting to do for a while now. And today is just one of those days where it really made sense to do it. It's kind of just a little chat, just a little kind of get to know you sort of thing, a personal kind of story and history about myself that I wanted to just kind of share with you guys. Just for fun, kind of a fireside chat as they love to call them, which, by the way, much better. So yeah, like I said, we're doing something different. Just a little personal chat and personal story from me to you guys. I even was talking earlier today on Twitter about how I feel like I haven't seen any sort of really interesting piece of news or story or event or reveal or anything that I found really interesting. The kind of stuff I like to talk about isn't always just so focused on like breaking news. I don't really consider myself someone who like reports on news. I think there's too many other really awesome channels that do that way too well. Obviously, Player Essence and Spawnwave come to mind. They have news presentation gaming and Nintendo news presentation videos that's just way too good for me to get into. So I'm never really trying to do that. I just like to find a story or an idea that's interesting to me that gives me a reason to just riff on it for, 10, 15, 20 minutes usually, and just kind of share my opinion on that event. And that's what I really haven't seen too much of the last week. And I was like, well, I do want to have this discussion. I thought that this would be fun a couple of weeks ago, so why not just do it? Okay, now that we're nice and cozy, sitting by the warm fire, let's discuss my personal history with gaming, and of course with Nintendo. That was the idea that I thought sounded really interesting and something that I thought maybe you guys would find interesting. I don't expect this to be necessarily a huge video. I don't think the topic will appeal to that many of my subscribers, but I'm hoping that a lot of you guys find it interesting because we all have our own sort of history with gaming. We're obviously passionate about the hobby. We spend a lot of our time and money on the hobby of gaming. Obviously, most of you guys who follow Rule of Two Review, huge Nintendo fans. That's what I, of course, prefer and play the most of. But what's really great is my history of gaming honestly even predates Nintendo. And then it was the introduction of Nintendo that became like a really cool kind of polar shift for me and something that kind of went away and then came back after a time. And it's just this really cool story. So I'm a fairly old man. I just turned 37 a couple of months ago. I was born in 1980. And that was an interesting and I think a really great time to have been born in terms of the history of gaming and where the industry and the hobby has gone and where it was at that time and what it's evolved into. I feel like anyone old enough to have lived during that time for gaming like myself really got to experience some special moments, some special products and consoles, and some special gaming moments. For myself, being born in 1980, I was old enough to have been gaming before the NES released in North America. And obviously my younger brother and one of my older brothers and I spent quite a bit of time playing on our Atari 2600. That was really the first gaming console and the first gaming experience I ever had. And I still even remember it vividly. I do remember being so young, 4 years old, 5 years old, playing on the Atari 2600 that I think was my older brother's. Either that or it was even my parents. It's hard to remember now who actually owned the thing. But I do remember spending a lot of time playing on that console well before the NES was ever introduced into our lives. And, games like Yar's Revenge and River Raid and Adventure, and the biggest one for me, Pitfall, the original Pitfall, those games stick out in my mind as games that were just completely consuming the hobby for myself and my brothers at the time, and how cool we thought gaming was to have, the classic little joystick, the black square with the one red button and the joystick, and that's how you were playing games and all these weird primitive things. And it was just so cool, and we had even a black and white TV that we would sometimes hook it up to. So I literally was playing Atari 2600 sometimes in black and white in the early 80s when I was a super small boy before the NES came out. And it was great. And I even remember we had the Mario Brothers game for the Atari 2600 because that also existed, and it was a Nintendo game. Nintendo was a company who had obviously started making like arcade games in the late 70s and early 80s before they finally made the NES, and I remember having a Mario Brothers game. And it was a lot of fun, and we didn't question it. Pitfall was incredible, you guys. That was a game when we play games nowadays like a Breath of the Wild or a Horizon, or even in the years past when other big epic scope games have been coming out like Uncharted or previous Zelda games, and you have this thing where you're like, wow, this huge, amazing, living, breathing world is in this video game that I'm playing, and I get to explore it and do all these cool things. It's so epic and vast. For me, and if you haven't seen what the original Pitfall looks like, for some context, you need to look up just watch 5 seconds of a video of this game, if for some reason you're young enough to have no idea what this game is like, and get an idea of what I'm talking about. That game, for me, at 4 years old in 1984, was what Breath of the Wild is to us today. I was just like, whoa, it's a cool jungle. It's like a real jungle, and you have all these things to do, and you're running, and you're jumping, and you're swinging on vines, and you're jumping over alligators, and you're falling into traps, and it's so epic. It's so real. And that's what it felt like to play certain Atari games in the early 80s. Now, we also had a Pong system, believe it or not, which was really cool. That was basically similar to a 2600, just a little console that you plugged into your TV. And, the cords, they didn't plug into the device the way like Atari controllers did. They were hooked up to the device, and you just pull one of these two little paddles out, and they have like a little like a wheel turny ball. And you just turned that to make the Pong thing go up and down, and there was like 5, 6 there was like an actual switch that you would switch the switch, and that would change what kind of game you were playing on the Pong machine. And that was cool for what it was, but it's Pong. We all know Pong. We totally get what that is. The real thing obviously came when the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, was finally introduced into our lives. And my memory of the NES really started with commercials. I remember seeing advertisements for the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Nintendo Entertainment System, now you're playing with power. That was the big thing. And advertising a couple of games like Mario and Duck Hunt. Way back in the day, early on in the channel, I discussed the original commercials for The Legend of Zelda and how amazing those were. I might get into that in a minute. But I basically remember commercials for the NES, and it was this amazing looking system with the craziest graphics. These games were so real. The colors, the shapes, everything was just so amazing. And also, the early marketing was very heavy on Rob the Robot. And what he was doing with this whole thing and dropping the little discs onto the whatever. And it was so exciting, you guys. For a 5, 6-year-old kid in the 80s, it was heaven on earth. I was like, I want that more than breath in my lungs. I need this Nintendo robot and that game now. I needed it so badly. And that robot, Rob the Robot, was the most amazing thing. I mean, they made it look so 80s cool. And so I just thought it was great. I mean, nowadays we know it was really kind of a crap thing. It didn't really work. But it was just so awesome back then when it was being advertised. And I remember going to the mall where we lived. This was when we lived in, would this have been New York or maybe North Carolina? No, this was New York. So we were living in New York, Syracuse, New York, in 1985, 1986. And I remember going to the mall, and my older brother was picking up an NES. And it was my parents and me and some of my brothers. There's 4 of us total. And he was getting an NES, and I was like so excited. But he got the NES without Rob, which, excuse me, which I was confused by at the time. I was like, where's the robot? But, they sold bundles with or without Rob the Robot at that time. Either way, that doesn't matter, because by the time the thing came home and Super Mario Brothers came on the screen for the first time, forget about it. I have a vivid memory. I remember the time of day. I remember the setup in our living room. The first time my older brother Jason set up and turned on the NES on our big, crappy, huge TV that we had, 1980s TV. And it was like, this is the most amazing thing. And it was also cool because, again, like I said, we did have the Mario Brothers Atari game, and I feel like I remembered having the memory of that game in my head before my brother turned on Super Mario Brothers. And I saw the jump. I was like, wow, Mario Brothers was fine, but this Super Mario Brothers, it's super. And the graphics and the world and the sound and everything was just so amazing. And it became a lasting memory, and it was huge, especially for my younger brother and I. He's even still active. He's got a podcast he does with some friends. Some great stuff. I mean, it really was the genesis, more than the Atari stuff. It was the genesis for myself, as well as my younger brother, to really start to plant the seeds of, we're going to be lifelong gamers. This is more than just a cool toy or fun fad or a fun thing, because the gaming industry continued to evolve with us. It was something that we were always going to be attached to, and it started for us when the NES first came into our lives, like I said. And beyond that was The Legend of Zelda. That was the biggest thing I remembered. And my older brother wouldn't let us younger guys play it for like weeks before eventually I think our parents probably told him he had to let us play it. But Super Mario Brothers and The Legend of Zelda, the commercial for The Legend of Zelda was so big on their slogan, The Legend of Zelda, the never-ending adventure for your Nintendo Entertainment System. And I couldn't process. My 5-year-old mind was freaked out at the idea of a never-ending adventure. And obviously that's not truly true. It's just that the quest repeats itself over and over again and there's like a couple changes. It's not never-ending, but it was never-ending. And they sold it that way in the commercials. You can look up the commercial and the guy's running around. He's like, Octoroks, Tektites, whoa, doing goofy stuff. And the never-ending adventure, man. And I just couldn't grasp it, and I needed it in my life. And finally seeing it the first time, the screen folds open and Link is there with the cave above. It's dangerous to go alone, take this. And I feel so blessed to have lived at a great age, 5-6 years old, a great age to have lived when all of this stuff was happening for the first time Nintendo showed us how they could take the world by storm, and they were going to be making the most amazing games in this brand new hobby for all time, for decades to come, you know. And I'm so lucky and proud that we were able to live through that, you know. And my recollection is that eventually that NES basically became mine and my younger brothers. I feel like as my older brothers kind of moved on, even though Jason did kind of stay, you know, like a pseudo-casual gamer throughout a lot of the 16-bit and early 32-bit days as well. But it was really more just something he was doing for fun, whereas my younger brother and I were very dedicated. Our groups of friends that we had in elementary school and into middle school, we were into it. We were following the whole thing. And the next big phase obviously was my personal favorite generation of all time. Even to this day, the best gaming generation ever, 16-bit. Undeniable. You can't argue with me on this because you're wrong. It's 16-bit. Trust me, that's the best time. And joking aside, that was the next big revolution. And that was also the first time I even heard the phrase generation. I mean, that was when they started to say the 16-bit generation of gaming is coming. And I just thought that was epic. That sounded epic. The 16-bit generation is so cool. And, you know, my first memory, although I don't think this was my first introduction to it, my first memory was also Nintendo related, and it was the first time I saw an image of Super Mario World near the back of a Nintendo Power. And again, you younger guys and girls out there don't understand how dope and cool the magazine age was when there was no internet and there was no information at our fingertips or at our computer screens or any of that. I mean, we got things through like news programs and through magazines. And there also was, you would never find video game content in video form on your TV, too. Like, what we have nowadays with websites like IGN and GameSpot and YouTube, and the fact that we can even do what we do to just talk about gaming on the internet, it's insane. Like, this never existed when we were kids back then. And so it was all about video game magazines, and I remember the Nintendo Power where I saw a picture of Super Mario World, and it was like the reveal of it, but it wasn't like a blowout. It was like this like weird little thing that I remember that's like, oh, a Super Nintendo is coming. It's a Nintendo that's better. It's newer. It's super. And here's Super Mario World where the games are going to be so much cooler. And it was like a couple of paragraphs on like one page. And there was a picture of Super Mario World. And it was the big bullet bill that's like half the size of the screen. And Mario next to it for like a size comparison. And I was like, dude, what is this? I would have been 10 or so, 9 or 10. I mean, well, let me think. The Genesis came out in 89. Super Nintendo, I believe, 91, if you guys can correct me. So maybe that means that my Genesis stuff was first. I don't remember when they started advertising the Super Nintendo, so forgive me here. My timeline might be messed up. I'm going to get to the Genesis in a minute regardless. But one of my earliest 16-bit memories was this moment of seeing Super Mario World. I feel like it predates my introduction to Genesis, and all I remember thinking was, how can games look this good? How is this possible? And oh my god, that bullet bill is amazing. It's so big. I was just like blown away. And what I took away from that I still think about to this day when I talk about it, was my first true understanding of what it meant for video games and video game consoles to improve. for graphics to improve, for games to get bigger, to controllers to get different and better, and the experiences to get longer and better and more epic in scope. It was the 16-bit generation and the leap from NES to Super NES and Sega Genesis that really showed that to me. Yes, I obviously experienced it from the Atari to the NES, but again, I was 4 years old, 5 years old. Like, I saw it happen, but it didn't hit me and sink in the way it did as a 10-year-old seeing it happen from 8 to 16-bit. And I gotta tell you, the feeling that getting excited over Super Mario World and a Super Nintendo gave me as a 10-year-old is a feeling that I will always remember and I will cherish forever. I mean, the level of excitement and what that did for me at that age, when gaming in and of itself was new. I mean, I'm sure young kids today get similar things when they see like Breath of the Wild. Like Breath of the Wild might be their second Zelda ever, and they get that feeling. But it's not the same because gaming has been that epic and amazing already for a long time now. But I mean, from the 7th generation, probably even the 6th generation on, we've been doing a lot of the same things, even Breath of the Wildy kind of things. So I just know it wasn't the same as seeing this stuff for the first time, man, going from 8 to 16-bit and like, what even is this? It's so cool. Who even knew this was possible? Now, the Genesis is interesting. One of my favorite consoles of all time. I have a very strong love for the Genesis because it was our primary, as weird as this sounds, it was our primary 16-bit console. You know, what I remember from the Genesis, beyond the super radical commercials for the Genesis that was all about Sega does what Nintendo don't, because it did come out when the NES was the current Nintendo system, so the Genesis was a much better platform than the NES. They were big on the power, they were big on the coolness and the slickness and like the 90s kid attitude with it, and then of course Sonic and blast processing, they pumped that stuff so much. And like, we were young kids, so we ate it up. We were like, that's the coolest thing to get. And when it came time for our parents to buy us a console, I do know that the Super Nintendo was out at this time because it was a matter of which one will they buy us? A Genesis or a Super Nintendo? My younger brother and I had to decide. And the thing is, I mean, we wanted a Super Nintendo. We knew it was great, but we had been going over to my friend's house at the time who had a Genesis already and had Sonic the Hedgehog. And it was everything that I wanted and more. I played Sonic at my buddy Eddie's house, and I was like, oh my god, this is just like the commercials. It's as cool as the commercials say. It was great. And that's why I, to this day, still love Sonic, because he altered my course for a while as a gamer, because he made the Genesis look so cool that that's what we decided to get, was a Sega Genesis, because my buddy Eddie had a Genesis, had Sonic, and we loved it. And I don't regret that decision. I mean, the Super Nintendo, is obviously at the end of the day the better console with the better library, sure. But at the time, that stuff didn't really matter. It was just what was the cool thing we wanted now, and it was the Sega Genesis. And you know, I love the Genesis. There were so many great games. I think that I remember having a debate about this before. The standard 3-button Genesis controller is just okay, but the smaller 6-button Genesis controller that was applicable to the fighting game genre, which was very important at that time, is one of the best controllers I've ever played. That controller is radical, super badass, and remember, for the kind of games that were coming out in the 90s for 16-bit consoles, it was perfect for that kind of stuff. And you know, there was a lot of amazing games on the Genesis. Beyond Oasis, Echo the Dolphin, Contra Hardcore was a great game. All of the Disney games, I think, were better on the Genesis than they were on the Super Nintendo. So many other things. A lot of great Japanese shooter kind of games and shoot 'em up kind of games were on the Genesis that were very, very good. Launched with Altered Beast. Wise from your grave. Oh my god, Altered Beast. It's so bad, but it was so cool because the graphics were amazing. I mean, that's why the Genesis was great to me, because it was the first time we owned something that gave us 16-bit graphics. And this was when it was, I think, okay for graphics to be the thing that were exciting and made a game good, because at this time in gaming, newer, better graphics were way bigger jumps. They were more significant jumps in visuals, and I think that they were so new that they actually did affect making a game good. And nowadays, that's not really the case. And so having 16-bit graphics for the first time was incredible. And, you know, down the road, I know we ended up having a Super Nintendo at some point. And of course, I mean, all the same stories. Zelda blew our minds, blew my mind. I keep talking about us because as kids, my younger brother and I were inseparable with our gaming. You know, I mean, A Link to the Past, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, of course, although that wasn't the game that made me the Super Metroid fan, but the game was amazing. Everything throughout the 16-bit era, it just was so good. And the way the console war felt when there was no internet, and when gaming was new, and when it was in its purest form of just Sega and Nintendo, was the best. It was a civil console war, and it happened at lunch at school and on the PE playground, and it happened in video game magazines, and it happened with a lot of the same kinds of games releasing on both consoles that were different, and you would argue over which version is better. And it's why, for so many other reasons, I just think that was the best era in gaming. Obviously, after that was the 64. 64, I've said it before, is like, it's my baby. I love the 64 so much. And, you know, it was great because that was so hard to get the year that it was coming out. And I remember that my parents couldn't find one for us for months and months and months. It was probably not until, I don't know, late 96, I think it came out. Or my parents were able to get it for us. I think right around Christmas time, I think my dad was able to find it for us. And I mean, playing Super Mario 64 was incredible. By the time this happened, I was 16 years old. I had my first job working for a Burger King. And what I remember about the Nintendo 64 is when we finally got it and set it up and we had just Super Mario 64, I was so blown away by what that game was doing. And obviously the 3D gameplay, the amazing controller. God, I'm skipping over so much stuff. I remember seeing advertisements in magazines, my friends and I, for the Ultra 64 before it was the 64, and first seeing that controller and thinking it was the dumbest, worst thing ever. I was like, oh my God, like, this system seems like it could be cool, like, in these magazine pictures, but that controller is horrendous. Obviously, we were proven wrong. And, you know, Super Mario 64 took my whole brain by storm. And what I remember vividly was the first week or so it was out was I would come home from high school and I would be able to play Super Mario 64 for like an hour, but then I'd have to go to my job for a couple of hours at night at Burger King. And I remember in the days after the 64, after we finally had the 64, I would be at work at Burger King, dumb 16-year-old teenager job, and I would just be thinking of Dire Dire Docks and the music for Dire Dire Docks and swimming around in this amazing world and how amazing this game was. All I could think of was like polar shift in my life. Nintendo 64, this gameplay, these graphics, that controller, Mario 64, changing the way I was looking at the world. Because I was at work and all I could think about was Mario 64. So there's plenty of other details that I could, you know, melt your ear off for the next 15 minutes about the jump from 64 to GameCube. Because the 64, again, is like one of my all-time favorite times in gaming as well. But I'll end with the last kind of part of the story in my history of gaming and how it really, truly made me the Nintendo fan that I am today. And it's a combination of two things. It is a combination of the GameCube and my time working for GameStop. And you've heard me on a couple of videos talk about my time working for GameStop. And that was, I worked for GameStop throughout pretty much the entirety of the 6th generation, from 2002 to 2005. And, you know, the 6th gen started 2000, 2001, ended pretty much 2005 when the 360 came out. Although, obviously, the PS2 lasted for a very, very long time. But regardless, you know, I worked in those pivotal years for the 6th generation for GameStop. But I got a GameCube before I started working for GameStop. And GameCube, I wasn't into the PS2 because I was kind of like anti-PlayStation for a while, because when you're young, you're dumb, and you think you have to pick sides. It's why I don't believe in picking sides nowadays, and I think picking sides and picking consoles and crapping on one guy because it's not the guy you like, and like playing a blind eye to the good things that the competition is doing is a sign of immaturity and a sign of a young person or an underdeveloped brain, in my opinion. I just think it's an absolutely ridiculous way to go. And I was that way when I was younger, and I've since learned. And so I was anti-PlayStation at the time, so I didn't care about the PS2. Xbox, I was very curious, and a friend of mine had it, and it was very interesting, but I was like, it's too weird, new thing. I mean, I want GameCube. I like Nintendo, that's cool, and like, I want a GameCube. So I remember they were impossible to find when they came out, and I've told this story before, actually. There was a used game store down the road from the apartment or condo I was living in at the time with a roommate. 2001, I was 21 years old, and I remember we had a really bad snowstorm. This was when I was living in Denver, really bad snowstorm, And I was like sick of being stuck in the house. So I remember walking to that store. It's called a Game Force, to see if they were open. And they were. And I just walked inside. I had my Nintendo 64 in my living room at the time. And I walked in, and they had a used GameCube. I mean, 3 or 4 weeks maybe after the thing had launched. I don't even know. It was really soon after it came out. And they had a used GameCube. And I was like, "Do you have a used GameCube?" And the guy was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Please hold it. I'll be right back." And I walked through the snow all the way back to my apartment, packed up all my Nintendo 64 games and console in a plastic bag, walked all the way back, traded it in for whatever I got, maybe $80. I have no idea what I got for it. And then I spent the rest of the money I had, and I bought that GameCube and Wave Race, because there was only like 4 or 5 games at the time, and Wave Race was the only one that looked cool. I didn't care. I was like, I just need a GameCube. Just give me this GameCube and I'll take Wave Race, because I like Wave Race 64. I like racing on waves. Give me that game. So I took home the GameCube, played Wave Race, the most amazing graphics, and I was set. It just absolutely was amazing. And, you know, of course, the library for the GameCube is what it is. I think one of the best libraries they've ever had. One of my favorite Nintendo consoles and video game consoles of all time. And how it ties into the GameStop thing is, it's tough to kind of put into words, but like, at the time that the GameCube came out, obviously, I was a passionate gamer. And I was a kid. I was a guy who grew up as a kid, loving games, mostly playing Nintendo, but playing all things. I still played on the PlayStation and the Saturn even as well, but I was still, you know, focused on Nintendo and video games. So but I wasn't like a hardcore gamer the way we kind of are now, the way that is defined nowadays. I was really just like a young kid that liked to hang out with my friends and, you know, smoke pot and do that whole kind of thing. And just kind of be like a dumb little rapscallion with my like stupid jobs or whatever, because I was just like a dumb idiot. I was 20, 21 years old. But I was like somebody who like did that, but also had gaming as this hobby in the background, is kind of what it was. The GameCube came out. I went through that whole process where I traded in my 64 to get it. And something about the GameCube really changed how I looked at gaming. I was like, because it was the first time that gaming, and even the PS2 didn't show me this, my friend's PS2. Having my own console, the GameCube, showed me like, gaming is getting cooler. Gaming is becoming like, kind of like tech. It's like something different. It's not, yeah, I mean, I loved it when it was a 64, but it was kind of like a toy, but not really, but a little bit. And so it was just a thing that we did to play through Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 and all those great games at the time. That was great, you know, GoldenEye, Mario Kart. But with the GameCube, I was like, it's just turning into something. Gaming is becoming something different. And it's not turning me off. It's bringing me in further. And I wanted to drive around and hunt down games like Smash Brothers when it came out. And like this, I don't know, whatever dumb third-party games like Spy Hunter that were coming out at the time. Eternal Darkness. Huge. That came out, I was like, this is awesome. It's really scary. It's a horror game. It's like rated M for mature. It's doing cool things. And it's just on this cool new Nintendo console with these mini discs and memory cards. This is just so neat. And then I was also, huge thing I have to talk about was playing Halo at my friend's apartment, because he had Halo, and we spent weeks going through Halo. I would go over every single night, and we would play through that campaign and play the multiplayer, hanging out. I didn't drink at the time. My buddies, you know, we were of age, but they were drinking, and I was hanging out, smoking pot. We were just doing the normal dumb kid thing, and like Halo blew our minds. So it was absolutely another of many seminal gaming moments for me. And it's like, you know, between Halo and the Xbox and my time with the GameCube and the PS2 was getting all these great games and all these things happening, I was like, I'm so into this. Like, this is really cool stuff, this gaming. And then I was fortunate enough to get my job at GameStop, became an assistant manager position within a couple of months. And then I was working for a company selling people games, talking about video games all day long, getting immersed in the culture of gaming and getting immersed in the business of gaming and getting immersed in the community with other gamers. And it was huge. And it's why I've said GameStop sucks now, but I am very fond of my time with GameStop because of the era that it happened in for me and the fact that it brought me closer to gaming, and I loved it so much. And suddenly I was so into the GameCube that I now had a job where I got to talk about the GameCube. So yeah, the Xbox and PS2 were cool, and there was cool stuff happening there, and I got to still experience it through customers and through my friends and coworkers who had them. But I was so dedicated to the GameCube that I started to realize I love this thing. I love this company. I love this machine, the GameCube, and I gotta keep letting people know why it's great. You're coming in to buy a console and you're not sure which one you want? Don't play that Metal Gear PS2 crap. You want this GameCube. It's got the Smash. It's got the Mario. And that whole experience was just something really important and special to me. And, you know, to end this very long video about my personal story here, what ended up happening was through the years, I ended up also owning an Xbox and a PS2, and I realized all these consoles are great. All these games in the entire industry are great. Gaming is badass. All the companies have things to offer. Nintendo's obviously and clearly the best, but everyone's got something to offer. And so that basically became kind of the person I am today. Somebody who loves Nintendo first and foremost and knows that they're the best at what they do. But I see value in Sony and Microsoft and their consoles and all these third-party companies making these third-party games. But not only was it my history as a kid playing Nintendo consoles and a couple of the other ones that were releasing as well, but it was that GameCube era and my time working for GameStop as somebody employed in a business that allowed me to experience gaming culture and gaming community and talking Nintendo and defending the GameCube and selling the GameCube to people on my own recommendation made me realize, man, Nintendo really is the best company doing this, you know? And gaming really is amazing. And with that being said, I think that's really it. You know, I spent so much time on myself as a kid. I have no idea if this will be interesting. It's a very long video. Not talking about gaming news or a thing that happened, just about myself and why I love video games and why I love Nintendo. But I think that's the gist of it, man. I feel very proud and fortunate to have grown up in the era I did, to have experienced all of the relevant gaming generations from Atari to 8-bit to 16-bit to 32-bit to 64-bit to 6th gen to 7th gen to now the 8th gen. And now we got the freaking Switch out doing all these crazy portable hybrid things. And we're getting a new Metroid, and Uncharted 4 is amazing, and Halo 6 is going to come out eventually, and just all this stuff. And it's just great. And it's because of my history with gaming that I'm still dedicated to it as a 37-year-old man with a professional career, and I still spend my time playing video games, talking about video games, and even running a YouTube channel all about Nintendo and video games. So that's it. That's the Get to Know Your Neighbor video for today. That's Rob's history with gaming and with Nintendo. And, you know, I probably could have made this an hour long if I got really into everything, but I'm sure it was way too long as it is. This is probably a 25-minute video at this point. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know if you enjoyed this. You know, I have another video that's on a similar topic I might want to make in a couple of weeks as well. And if you guys respond well to this, I'll do that. If you don't care, then I won't. But, I mean, I love talking about this. It's why it was so long. It's really fun to share my history with gaming and Nintendo. So, of course, I want to hear what you guys think about my history and everything that I talked about. But I also want to hear your history with gaming, your history with Nintendo, if you have a history with Nintendo, which, let's face it, if you're a fan of this channel, you have a history with Nintendo. And yeah, just have fun with it, man. Let's celebrate how awesome this hobby is, and this industry takes us for a ride emotionally sometimes, but it's all in the name of having fun. And I think that's it. I'm going to wrap this up. So thank you so much for tuning in and listening to me talk about myself for a while, guys. This is Rob of Rule of Two Review, and I'll catch you next time on another video.